Hey book readers! Today we're going over a complete chapter-by-chapter recap of Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. The sequel, Ruthless Vows, comes out on December 26th. So this is your complete recap so that you're ready for the sequel to be caught up on all of the details that happened that you don't want to have forgotten. Right off the bat, Divine Rivals starts with a prologue that shows our main character Iris sending her brother Forrest off to war. But it starts with her taking him to the train station to say goodbye, and he's going to the war. We learn that he's 5 years older than her and she doesn't want him to go. She describes him as tall and herself as petite, and that they always get mistaken for twins because they have wide set hazel eyes, freckles, and wavy chestnut hair. This was just like a little tidbit thrown right at the very beginning, and it made me like, is this gonna come into play down the road? Which it didn't in this book, and I don't know if it's going to, but I just thought it was interesting she said it that way. Maybe it's just to say they look a lot alike. Forrest tells her he thinks he's only be gone for a few months. Iris wants to enlist to go with him, but he has made her make two promises. One, that she will take care of their mother, and two, that she will stay in school and enjoy her final year. Iris tells us that the war has just begun and that Forrest had heard a song or encountered the goddess and enlisted. He gives her his trench coat, calls her Little Flower, that's his nickname for her, and then tells her goodbye. Also learned that his mother was not happy that he did this, and she did not even come to tell him goodbye. So then it jumps into chapter 1, which is 5 months later. So 5 months after she's told her brother Forrest goodbye, she is headed to her job. This is where we hear about our male main character Roman for the first time. He's introduced as her work nemesis. They work together at a newspaper, and he's described as tall and lithe with cheekbones that could cut stone. It also tells us that Roman's grandfather pioneered the railroad and that his family's very wealthy. Also that Roman went to a prestigious school for wealthy families and that she did not. Already right off the bat, she's broken one of her promises to her brother because she's had to drop out of school. She's 18 and she lives with her mother, but she's had to drop out of school to get a job to help support the family. They are writers at a newspaper reporting about the war, and they're competing for the next columnist position at the Gazette. We also learn that his name is Roman C. Kit, and we don't know what the C stands for. And she always pesters him with guesses. We learn that the war began in a small town surrounded by gold 7 months ago, in a very small town called Sparrow, where sheep outnumber people 4-1. It rains only twice a year because of an old charm cast by an angry and now slain god centuries ago. We don't get much about the war yet. We also learn that their newspaper kind of censors war materials and doesn't let them really report on exactly what's going on. Basically, chapter 1 is just setting up the main characters. Iris and Roman are enemies, rivals at their workplace, competing for this position, and that they're in a war between gods. Chapter 2 starts with she goes to a building where she's shopping for food, and it's enchanted so that the food that she can afford comes to the front. And she said she doesn't trust these places because they're nosy and unpredictable. Here's where she sees headlines about the war from another newspaper, and she's shocked because she wants to know the truth, but her newspaper doesn't report on it. So it talks about like monsters and things at the war that she can't hardly believe because she was led to believe that monsters were from a long time ago and that these things don't happen anymore. So then Iris goes home, and this is where we see her mother, and that she's not doing well because she's an alcoholic and that she has deteriorated since her brother left. So she tells us that she sold her grandmother's radio to buy more alcohol. Iris is not happy with her mother. This is also where we are introduced to Iris's typewriter. It says that she uses her grandmother's typewriter to write letters to her brother who is at war. She says she hasn't heard from him since he left 5 months ago, despite him promising that he would be in contact, and she's afraid something has happened to him. We also learn that Iris's mother was fired from her job for drinking, and that's why Iris was forced to drop out of school and get a job. And then it tells us that she puts the letters that she has typed to Forrest into her wardrobe, which is just a closet, and they vanish. And she keeps putting the letters there only for them to vanish. And she wonders if there's magic left over from centuries past that is taking her letters to her brother, or that's at least what she's hoping, but she doesn't know what's happening to her letters. Then she tells us about a plate that she found on the inside of the typewriter that says the third Alouette and made especially for DEW. She doesn't know exactly what it means, but it is the initials of her grandmother, Daisy Elizabeth Winnow. And at the end of this chapter, she hears a sound, and that's when she finds a new letter under her wardrobe folded different than hers. So she knows it's not hers because it's folded different, and it simply says, "This isn't Forrest." And so then we're like, what's going on? So chapter 3 is where she's like in shock that she's gotten this letter and it's not to her brother, and she's trying to remember everything she's written so far because she's like, who am I sending this to and what have I said? She remembers that she told him that she dropped out of school, that she has a job at the Gazette, but she never revealed her true name, signing it only as Little Flower. And then it goes back to her workplace where Iris and Roman have interaction, competing against each other. And then Iris talks about following her dreams with a coworker and says that writing about important things is her dream. So they talk about articles that their competitor, this other newspaper, writes about monsters on the battlefield and disappearing soldiers on the front. And that Iris has like a desire to know the truth and to help others know it too. And she's upset that her newspaper doesn't let them report on that. So here we get quite a bit of world building about the gods and like their history and the war and what's going on. So Iris has seen these headlines on the other newspaper talking about monsters at the front and what's going on. And she wants to know more about their history because she hasn't been able to learn a lot. So she goes to the library and she says that there's books that have the stories, but you can't check them out. She has to read them at the library. So she goes to the library to read them. And she says it's pages and pages full of stories of gods and goddesses from a long time ago, from before the humans had slain them or bound them deep into the earth, before magic had begun to bloom from the soil, rising from divine bones, charming doorways and buildings, and rarely settling into objects. And then she says, but now Enva and Dacre had awoken from their prisons because Ethereals had been spotted near the front, and she wanted to know more about them. She wants to know because she was never taught in school. So she learns about the Skywards. Basically, there's two different types of gods. There's the Skywards and the Underlings. And the Skywards ruled Cambria from above, and the Underlings had reigned below. Once there had been 100 gods between the two families, and over time they had killed each other, and only 5 remained. And then those 5 had been overcome by the humankind, and Dacre had been buried in the west, and Emba in the east. It also talks about the other gods, Mir in the north, Alva in the south, and Luz in central Burrow. She says they were never meant to wake, and that where they were laid to rest were rumored to be places of great enchantment. Sites that they were buried like draw people who are curious, and it also says that it draws people who are ill. Iris says that she's never been to the grave in the east, and she continues to search for the answers that she craves. She says that Dacre started the war by burning the village of Sparrow to the ground and killing the families there, yet that devastation failed to attract Enva to him, and she remained hidden, except she came out to string her harp to enlist soldiers. So it talks about how Enva has like a magical harp, and when soldiers hear the music of the harp that they're called to enlist. And so it kind of like implies that this is what happened to her brother. Then she's looking for the history of what happened between Dacre and Enba, because she's like, why is there a war? What is happening? Why has he started this war with her? What's going on? But she can't find the history because the pages had been ripped out of the book that she found. And then she finds nothing about Ethereals or where they came from, what controls them, or how dangerous they are to humans, and she wants to know more. Then in chapter 4, Iris writes a reply to the letter that she received beneath her wardrobe, and this is the first time where Roman's POV is introduced. Immediately find out that he is the one who has been receiving her letters, and that he already knows Iris's identity behind the letters because of what the information that she's put in it already. He sees her newest letter, he reads it. We learn that his family's mansion is charmed, that he has curtains that open themselves, flowers that bloom in random places when it rains, and that the house can sense his troubles and like consoles him with cookies and things. So he thinks that his enchanted house is responsible for bringing these letters from Iris to him. He says he instantly knew it was Iris writing the letters and that she gave herself away by telling her position at the Gazette, and he says that she has an exquisite writing style. He ignored them at first because he thought she knew that she was sending them and that she was trying to distract him. But then he realizes they're to her brother at war and that it just tore him up to read them. He couldn't decide how to respond. He thought about telling her at work, but then he didn't want to embarrass her. He was moved by her writing, and the rivalry was strengthened. She's like encouraging him to do better because he wants to be as good as her. Then he writes a reply to her, puts it in his wardrobe, and he thought he was crazy for putting it there. Like, is it gonna get taken or not? And it does. So they begin writing back and forth to each other through the wardrobe. He doesn't tell her who he is because he doesn't want her to stop writing to him. He has saved all the letters that she has sent him except for the very first one. And he tells her that he wants to keep his identity secret and trust the old magic at play, and that he'll read whatever she writes. So then we get into chapter 5. This is where Iris learns about a position open at the other newspaper for writers willing to go to the battlefront and report what they see. And people who do that make twice the amount that she makes at the Gazette. Her boss at the Gazette believes they're trying to scare people, and he doesn't agree with them. He's like, they're not writing the truth. That's not real. He's in denial about all of it. She says that when Dacre started taking over town after town, that the towns would call for help and ask for aid, but the people in the East didn't believe them and they never sent help, and that they underestimated him and how many people would fight for Dacre. And so now it's turned into something worse because they waited too long. Her boss at the Gazette gives her 3 days to write about something to prove herself for the promotion. So Iris and Roman fight about it being a fair fight, and then Roman calls her out for being sloppy and late all the time, and Iris calls him out that if he gets the promotion, it's only because his father bribed the boss. So Iris is offended and she is not happy at the end of that chapter. Then in chapter 6, she gets home and her mother has dinner ready. She realizes her mom is drunk, but she's trying to have conversation. She describes the moment when Forrest heard Inva's music. So she says he heard Inva's music calling him to enlist, and he came straight home and started packing right away and saying he had to go. Every time that it talks about this, I think it's so interesting, and I just wonder if it's going to tell us more about that. Like, is it almost like a spell that she's casting on them, or do they genuinely want to fight for her? I don't know. Iris's mother reassures her about the competition at her job, and she reassures her that her brother is still alive, and she promises to be better, and she curls her hair. It's like they have a nice moment despite her being drunk. They have like a nice moment together. And then we meet Roman's parents. So it switches to Roman's POV, and we meet Roman's parents. They introduce him to company that have come over. He doesn't know who they are. He meets their daughter named Eleanor. She says she prefers to spend time in her father's laboratory since music is now associated with Imba. Imba plays this magical harp. And so then when war happens, music is like banished. It's like outlawed because they say it's associated with Imba. Roman's starting to realize that this family is Dacre sympathizers, and he's not very happy about that. So whenever the girl says this about Imba's music, Roman stands up for her and says Imba's music is nothing to be scared of, and he describes it as guiding souls from their bodies to the next realm, and that her songs are woven with truth and knowledge. And Roman's father shrugs it off as a myth, like that's not real. Then this is where we hear that his father has arranged a marriage with this girl, this family that's at his house. He senses that there are ulterior motives happening with the arranged marriage because their family wouldn't usually be one that arranges a marriage. And then he also notices Eleanor is also apprehensive and afraid. Then it goes to chapter 7, and we hear Roman saying, like, he's telling himself, this is what I deserve, that he deserves this for being his father's sole heir. And this is like foreshadowing information we're going to learn about later, but we don't really know what he's talking about at this time. He's saying, like, this is punishment for what I've done because I'm his only heir. So then we see Iris writes to Roman and asks what he knows of Dacre and Inva since she can't find it in the library. So Roman's enchanted house sends him a myth that his grandfather documented about the Skywards and the Underlings. It says that two families divided the gods of old, the Skywards and the Underlings, like we have learned already. So the Skywards ruled above and the Underlings reigned below. And most of all, they hated each other, as immortals are prone to do, and engaged each other in challenges to prove who was more worthy to be feared or loved. Dacre Underling was hewn from white limestone with veins of blue fire, and that he decided he would capture one of his enemies because he was bored of living day after day, season after season, year after year, because such is the weight of immortality. He is described as the god of vitality and healing, and he craved a challenge. So he asked a human if he knew the name of the most beloved Skyward divine, because he wanted to take that god or goddess. And the human immediately says, she plays music on a harp that would melt the coldest of hearts. She ferries mortal souls after they die, none as fair as her above all. Dacre decided he must have this Skyward goddess. He travels up through the earth, through stone and trees, and he was overwhelmed by the sun because he's been underground. He had to stay in a cave for 3 days and 3 nights to adjust to the light, and even then he chose to wander at night where the moon was gentler. So he begins to ask the mortals where Enva is, where he can find the finest of skywards, and they say she can be found in the last place you thought she would be. Dacre was too impatient and angry to upturn every stone for her, so he decided he would call up his hounds from below, and they're described as sinewy, fire-hearted beasts with a translucent skin and teeth that spawned nightmares and dreams. It says the hounds roamed the land searching for beauty and devouring those who got in their way. He sent the hounds because Dacre thought Enva would be beautiful and that the hounds would be drawn to her, but when the sun rose, the hounds were forced to go back below and Dacre still had not found her. So then he summons his ethereals from caves beneath, and they're described as great wyverns with filmed eyes, membranous wings, and poisoned talons. They can withstand the sun, so they were able to fly during the day, so they flew through the sky searching for beauty and destroying whatever flew beneath them. Soon a storm came and the ethereals' wings threatened to tear, so Dacre sent them back below. It was only when he walked the land himself that he came upon a graveyard, and in the graveyard was a woman. It describes the woman as ordinary by his standards, with long dark hair and green eyes, and that she was dressed in homespun clothes and that she was slender. He decided he would not waste his time asking her where to find Enva and passed by her without a second glance. So as he walks away, he hears the music of a harp. He says it's sweet and golden, and even though the sky was gray and the wind was cold, he heard the woman sing and her voice pierced him. So stung by the beauty of her voice, he says it was beauty that could not be seen but felt. So he crawls back to her and says, Enva, come with me. He had to wait for her to sing, and so then it says when she sang her last song, she looked at him. She says, Dacre, underling, god of below, why have you brought such chaos among innocents? What do you mean? He says. She says, your hounds and ethereals have killed the people. With your power, you could have healed their wounds, but you did not. She said, now I must sing their souls into eternity, for your creatures took them before it was their appointed time. So she's not happy with him because he's brought chaos where there shouldn't have been chaos, and people now are dead that shouldn't be dead. Dacre rises and says he felt insignificant and unworthy in her eyes. He says, I did it to find you. And she says, you could have found me on your own had you just looked. He says, will you join me in ruling the world beneath? She says, no, I'm happy here. Why would I go there with you? He says, to forge peace between our two families. Although peace was not actually what he wanted. And she says, I think not. And she melted into the wind before he could grasp the hem of her dress. So he's mad. He gets furious. He decides to unleash his power on the innocents. He would not heal them. So he's thinking to himself, I'm going to make her come back. And he starts killing people to make her think twice. He starts to torment the people until she gives herself up as an offering. Says his anger made the ground shake and he made new chasms and rifts. He was right. As soon as innocents began to suffer, Enva came to him. She says, I'll follow you into your realm below. I'll live with you in the shadows on 2 conditions. You will uphold peace and you will permit me to sing and play my instrument whenever I desire. Dacre was enchanted by her and that he agreed. He took her below, but he did not know what her music would do once it was strummed deep in the earth. So that's like the first half of the myth. That's all that Roman was given, and so that's all that we see yet. And it says that typing this whole myth to her had calmed him down. Then in chapter 8, it says that Roman's father sends an announcement to the Gazette, the newspaper where they work, about his arranged marriage to be posted in the paper. It says that Roman would be married in 1 month. Iris can tell something is upsetting Roman. It says that she congratulates him on his engagement, and he's surprised to find out that she knows about it. And she's surprised at his reaction. She offers to help him with his article about the missing soldiers, and she tells him her brother is missing in the war. This is like their first interaction where they're not like mean to each other. So Roman joins her for lunch and apologizes for his prejudice when he first met her, and she's surprised about that. She didn't expect him to apologize. So he says as soon as he read her work, he knew she was far more than he thought. She says, why are you marrying this girl if not for love? And he says it's for the good of our families. He asks about her brother being missing. She tells him that he left 5 months ago and she expected to hear from him or receive a letter about his death, but that she hasn't heard anything. She tells him that he can quote her in his article as long as he doesn't say that it's her. She wants to remain anonymous. Then in chapter 9, Iris's mother is gone when she gets home and she's worried, but she keeps telling herself it's okay. Her and Roman write to each other that night. They share secrets and inner thoughts, and she begins to think that the person on the other end of the letters lives in the same place but a different time, like a fissure of time. She's trying to like figure out what's going on, and she says maybe they live here too, just at a different time, and they're sending each other letters. And in chapter 10, Iris goes to work and she hears news of a dead body found hit by a tram, and she reads the description of the body and she's immediately worried. She leaves straight then and goes to the station and identifies the body of her mother. And then it goes to chapter 11. After she had heard about the dead body, she left work and went to the station, didn't tell anybody. From the station, she went home. So then in chapter 11, Roman comes to her house to check on her because she didn't show up at work. She's really embarrassed that he's seeing the way she lives because she's very poor. He asks if everything is okay, and she doesn't tell him about her mother. She doesn't want him to know. Then in chapter 12, she writes a letter to Roman, even though she doesn't know it's Roman, with some of her deepest thoughts. She tells him things she's tired of, how she actually feels, telling him that she lost someone. His reply tells some personal details as well. This is where we learn that Roman had a little sister named Georgiana, and that he called her Dell because she liked her middle name Delaney the best. So he tells the story that he had taken her for a swim, that he fell asleep on the shore, and that she drowned while he was sleeping. And then it also tells that when this happened, he was so upset and distraught, and that he had a dream that a goddess was offering to take his pain if he agreed to wipe all memory of his sister. And he says no. He would rather remember her even though he still feels all this pain. So this is what it was hinting at before, whenever he was like, this is what I deserve. This is the punishment that I deserve because of what I did. He thinks about this a lot. He uses this against himself frequently. And then in chapter 13, Iris is kind of coming to terms with how much her life has changed. Roman is still asking her questions about what happened when she left work. The boss asks for her article because she had a deadline for this article to get the promotion, and she says she doesn't have it. He tells her he's disappointed in her. She doesn't tell anybody about her mother dying because he doesn't want them to know. So she gets the obituaries for that day, and she's given to write the obituary of her mother because nobody knows it was her mom. Roman gets the promotion that they were both fighting for, but then he asks the boss for more time to write another article because Iris's mother has died. And she asks how he knows, and he says he read the obituary. So the boss apologizes for the loss, but says Roman still gets the promotion. Like, so sorry. She realizes she doesn't want to work there anymore, and she quits. She's like, peace out. So she quits. She leaves immediately, and she never looks back. Then in chapter 14, Iris writes a letter to her pen pal telling him that she's leaving and that he might not hear from her for a while. So she plans to go to another newspaper and ask to be hired on as a war correspondent. She feels guilty for not having gone and looked for her mother that night. And then she packs up the only things that hold meaning for her in case she's hired on immediately. So she puts on her mother's locket and she packs the typewriter and she's ready to go. But she sees another letter under the closet, but she leaves it lying on the floor. So that comes in at the end. Now we kind of have wrapped up this first section where they work together at the newspaper, and now we're going to their time as war correspondents. In chapter 15, we get Roman's point of view that he got what he wanted in the promotion, but that he's still not satisfied. He confronts his father to say he's not marrying that girl. Like, he doesn't want to marry Eleanor. And the father says, what is this really about? He confronts Roman and says, you like that girl at work. And Roman's like, no, this isn't about her. There's no other girl. Roman's father says, I won't see my grandchildren's blood muddled by the gutter. Roman calls out his father's prejudice, but his father says, you have to marry the girl that they picked, and then he can sleep with whoever he wants. He just can't have any kids with her. And Roman is so astounded by that and can't believe that his dad would say that. And then Roman's father shows him a crate. He says that the crate holds their future because Dacre will one day reach us. He says breaking the commitment to marry the girl will jeopardize his plans for the family. Inside the crate, it appears to be bombs. He describes it as slender metal canisters the length of his forearms resting like silver bullets in the crate. And Roman's dad says that his fiance is helping her father create them. Roman says, you're going to kill innocent people, but his dad doesn't care. He says, this is genius. He says, what's going to happen to the people in power when Inva falls and Dacre takes the city? So he's trying to get on the good side of Dacre because he thinks Dacre's going to win the war. Roman says he's not going to be a part of it. He doesn't want to be a Dacre sympathizer. His father says, you're going to do exactly what I tell you to do. And he says, you're going to do it even if you don't want to, because you're going to do it for your mother, who is still grieving over your recklessness. So he's using the guilt of his sister dying against him. Then Roman loses his will to fight and he leaves. He goes upstairs. He hides Iris's letters in the floorboard to protect them from his father. Then it moves to Iris's POV. Iris arrives to apply as a war correspondent. She describes why she wants to be a correspondent. She says she believes that people don't realize the seriousness of the war, and she wants to help them see what's coming to them soon. She says she wants to write about things that matter. Her new boss boss, her name is Helen, starts telling her things immediately. She's like, here's a jumpsuit that you're gonna wear because this shows that you're neutral in the war. And then her boss sees her typewriter and she knows what it is. And she's like, do you know what you have? And Iris is like, no, not really. So the boss tells her the story of her typewriter. She says this is an Alouette and that there are only 3 made just like it. She says it's very rare and precious and valuable. She says a very wealthy man named Richard Stone, who was a widower, had one daughter named Alouette. Daughter fell sick with tuberculosis, so she couldn't be with her friends. So he had 3 enchanted typewriters made for her to be able to communicate with her friends, so that when she typed on them, it would go to her friends and her friends' letters would come back. Sent letters back and forth for 1 year before the girl passed away. And when she died, her father donated her typewriter to a museum. The other 2 girls kept theirs and nobody knew what happened to them. And she says that each of them have a silver plate engraved with their initials. Iris realizes it's their typewriters connecting them and not the wardrobes or not some fissure in time. She realizes that it was her grandmother who was a friend of this girl. So the boss asks, are you sure you want to go to the war as a correspondent? She's like, you can sell this typewriter for a fortune. Iris says no, she doesn't want to sell it. She wants to keep it and she wants to report on the war. So it says she's being sent to a town 600 miles west of where she grew up. So she's grown up in the east where Enva is. And now she's going to the west, closer to where Dacre was supposedly laid to rest. So she just tells her about how it's under a different chancellor, so there might be different laws, and that she has to go to this train that runs every 6th day. She gives her instructions on how her articles will be sent back, and she says she has to leave in 5 minutes, so she's ready to go right away. Helen asks what name she wants to write under. She starts thinking about how she misses Roman. She didn't expect to miss him. She says she just wants to write on her name, Iris Winnow, and Helen says she can come up with something better. Basically all it says. Then it goes into chapter 16. Iris is taking the train ride to where she's going to go. It says that they have to wait for darkness to drive the train, and she doesn't know why. Then she meets another war correspondent. Her name is Thea Atwood, but she goes by Addie. Addie is going to be her companion as a war correspondent, and Addie tells her she thinks they're waiting for the dark to drive because of bombs, but she isn't sure. Then it goes to chapter 17, and they meet Marisol, who is their host. She's the owner of the bed and breakfast where they're going to live during their time as war correspondents. So they tell us that Marisol is 33, that they're only 80 kilometers away from the war front. Addie tells us that she's the oldest of 6 kids, 3 girls and 3 boys. Iris tells them that her brother's fighting in the war for Enva. Marisol tells them that there are 3 different sirens that happen at any given time. So she describes a continuous siren at night, which means that the hounds are coming. She says you have 3 minutes to extinguish all light, cover your windows, and lock your doors before the hounds come. She describes the hounds as the size of a wolf and that they destroy anything in their path. She says they've lost a flock of sheep and some livestock, and that the town has a curfew where they live. And then she says siren 2 is a continuous siren during the day, and that means that the Ethrals are coming. And when that sounds, they have 2 minutes to take cover, that they can go inside and take cover, or that they can take cover immediately where they are. She said that they are the wyverns and that Dacre uses them to carry bombs in their talons, which they will drop on anything they see that moves below. She says this is why the train doesn't travel during the day, because it has a better chance to outrun the hounds at night. And then she says siren 3 is intermittent during day or night, but has never been wailed yet, because if you hear it, it means you need to evacuate immediately because the soldiers at the front are retreating and Dacre is coming. Iris asks where the sirens come from. She says they come from a few towns over that have a really good vantage point and are able to give them a warning. In chapter 18, Iris gets in her new room, but she can't sleep. So she wonders if the letters will still send from here since she doesn't have her wardrobe, but now she knows it's the typewriter. She tries to send a letter. She asks him to complete the myth between Dacre and Enva, and she tells him she thinks they have a magical connection. He replies and asks where she is and how she is. She tells him she's a war correspondent, and she describes a little bit about what it's like, and he instantly replies that he'll look for the completion of the myth. He says he hopes she'll find her place and that he wishes her well. And in chapter 19, Iris and Addie and Marisol go to the infirmary. She's anxious about what she's going to see, and she's afraid she's going to see her brother there. She describes the injuries she sees, and she begins to worry that she's not going to recognize her brother because some of the people are unrecognizable. She talks with a female soldier in the infirmary who's playing cards named Prairie. She just plays cards with her. Iris asks Prairie how she can find out where a soldier is stationed, and she tells her who to write to. And then Prairie asks Iris to write a letter for her. And then Iris offers to write a letter for every soldier. And so this is kind of her mission while she's there. Iris begins to believe her brother might be dead since she hasn't heard from him. She writes a letter to someone to try to figure out where he is. Then in chapter 20, she gets another letter from Roman. He has found the other half of the myth, and he gives little details about himself himself, she notes that he tells her he slouches and that he has long hair. She's just cataloging all these things about him. So then it gives us the second half of the myth of Dacre and Imba. Imba loved the sky and the taste of the wind, and she was not happy in the realm below. Dacre served her in the beginning, and he was eager to make her happy, but she knew she was a skyward, that there would be restlessness in her. He could never coax a smile from her, and he asked her to play music for him in his court. So she plays for everyone with her harp. She sang a lament. Every creature began to cry. So then she sang a joyful song and watched as it influenced everyone. So she starts to figure out that her music can influence the people where she's at. Then she sings a lullaby, and then everyone falls asleep. While they sleep, she roams Dacre's underground. 3 days and 3 nights later that they awoke. He called to her, she came back and acted like she had also been asleep. So she's getting a little tricky. She's being a little devious. Dacre trusted her and began to be hungry for her music again. So this time she played her music twice as long, and his court slept for twice as long, and it was 6 days and 6 nights. When he awoke and called for her, there was no answer. She had gone above. But when he emerged from below, Imba and a skyward army awaited them, and the battle was long and bloody. So many of the underlings fled, and Dacre was wounded by Imba's own arrow in his shoulder. He had no choice but to retreat, and he descended to the fires below. He blocked it off so no one from above could come below, and he plotted his revenge. Dacre was never victorious, and he could never best the skywards, so he decided to terrorize the mortals above. Imba had learned all the passages while he had slept, and he didn't know that she knew her way around. So she returned 2 centuries later with her harp with a plan to make him and his court sleep for 100 years. Some say that she was successful because there was peace for a time, but others say she was unable to use her power for that. And it ends by saying, it's never wise to offend a musician and to choose your lovers wisely. So Iris reads this and she's like kind of skeptical because she had been taught of defending themselves against Dacre and his brothers who were tricked into drinking a potion. And so it's conflicting stories and she wonders like which one is true.
So she's like wondering if perhaps it has been Inva all along who has been causing issues. And she starts to understand why Dacre is angry. So she writes her pen pal back to say thank you. She asks him to mail the letters from the injured soldiers. And she asks if he has a typewriter similar to hers and what his is engraved with. So he replies and says yes, he'll send the letters and describes his typewriter. He says that his engraving says the second alouette made for HMA, which is his grandmother's initials. So her theory is confirmed about the alouettes. She tells him that her grandmother also gave her her typewriter, but then in the middle of replying to him, a siren goes off and it's the hound siren. So she says they have 3 minutes to prepare. So she hastily writes a goodbye and she sends it. She covers the windows and lights and she goes to Marisol's room and she meets with the other girls to spend the night in Marisol's room. Marisol pushes furniture against her door and loads a gun and finds a flashlight. She tells Iris to point the light at the hounds if they get in so that she can shoot them. They begin to hear the hounds outside. So then in chapter 21, Roman gets her last message and he's worried because there's so many typos and errors at the end and he can tell that she was rushed and that something's happening and he starts to imagine what could have happened to her and he gets really worried. He says he can't sleep and then he rereads all of her old letters. He remembers that he had insomnia when his sister died and he's drawn into the kitchen when he's wandering around. And when he's in the kitchen, he sees his grandmother who is also awake in the night and that she gives him tea and invites him to talk. He describes her as having a knack for reading minds and he tells her he's awake because he's awaiting a letter and she smiles. She asks if he's using her typewriter to write to Daisy Winnow's granddaughter. He says yes and asks how she knew and she says a mere hunch. She knew Daisy didn't want to give her typewriter to the museum so she assumes that's what's going on. So he asks his grandmother about Daisy Winnow. She describes Daisy as a dreamer and that she didn't care about her social status. And the grandmother asks what Iris is like. He describes Iris as being similar to how she described Daisy. She asks if he's going to let his father write his story. She encourages him to take a risk for the things that matter. In the morning, he sees a letter from Iris. She says she's okay and that she's going back to the infirmary. He's reassured, but he realizes how weary he was worrying about her. Iris is working in the garden with Addie and Marisol. They see evidence of the hounds, claw marks and things. She says sometimes they don't see them for days and sometimes Dacre sends them every night. This is where Marisol tells us that she's married to her wife Keegan. She describes how they met. She says that Keegan rented a room in her bed and breakfast and that she called out her garden for looking bad. Keegan decides to stay and help with the garden and that Marisol very quickly knew she was the one. Well, Iris says she'd like to meet Keegan and realizes that Keegan must have been gone for a long time because of the state of the garden. So then she writes a letter to her pen pal asking if he wants to meet. She says she wants to see and hear him and he replies with the same and they talk about what they might do when they meet. She receives a letter about her brother's location location, and they tell her where he was sent when he arrived, but that there's no update and that his location is unreliable. Then in chapter 22, she takes a walk with Addie and they talk about Keegan and where she might be. Iris asks Addie if she believes in love with a stranger, and she says she believes in anything. They kind of talk about her pen pal and being in love with this person. So then here, Iris lists the things she knows about her pen pal. So she says she knows he slouches sometimes, that he has his father's chin. He has described his hair as perfect and knight errant, that he has a grandmother full of myths, that he's Dell's older brother, that he lives in Oath where she's from, that he's 19 years old, and that his writing is impeccable and often makes her laugh. So she tells him these things, like, these are the things I know about you. And then she's like, but I don't know your name and I want to know your name. And he doesn't reply for an hour. But then he replies, you know everything about me that you need to know, and that you can call me Carver because that's what Dell used to call him. She tells him her name and she's longing to know more about him. She says she's always disliked her name and says the women in her family have always been named after flowers. And he says the first thing he thought was iris, a transitive verb, to make iridescent. I don't know. This is just them writing about wanting to know each other. And then here, Iris writes another letter to somebody in the war to try to find out more about her brother. In chapter 23, Roman can't believe he's told Iris his middle name. He says he's thinking about her all the time and he's worried about telling her who he is the next time he sees her, because what is she going to think? What's going to happen? It needs to be done in person, so he's just waiting for her to come back. Then his father comes to his office to tell him he planned lunch for Roman and the girl that he's engaged to, and that they're getting married in 3 weeks. Iris is with Marisol when a lorry comes in from the front with a load of wounded soldiers. Iris and Addie flip a coin to see who will go to the front because the driver of the lorry says he can take one of the correspondents, and Addie goes to the front to report. Then it goes back to Roman and he's going to lunch with Eleanor. Eleanor tells him she's not making bombs with her father, that there's something else, but that she won't tell him what they are until they're married. He realizes she's in love with someone else and he tries to talk her out of marrying him. And she says, like, this is what we have to do. This is the duty to our family. We'll just stay separate until we need a kid, pretty much. So he realizes he'll never be married to a woman who loves him if he marries her, because she already loves someone else and he's not so sure about that. But he keeps telling himself, this is what I deserve for what I did. Roman sees an article that Iris has written from the front and he's so proud of her. He folds it and he saves it. He can't stop thinking about her, and Iris inspires him to start making his own story. So this is just like bouncing back and forth between Iris and Roman's POV. So then we have Iris and she's still assisting the wounded soldiers. She asks Marisol if Keegan is fighting in the war. She says yes, and that she didn't want Iris's boss, the newspaper, to know because she was afraid that she wouldn't send correspondence to her. Then she writes a letter to Roman saying she doesn't feel brave enough to be part of the war. Roman writes her back, encouraging her by saying the strength that he sees in her. So then in chapter 24, Addie comes back from the front. We learn that Addie is a musician and that it's a secret because it's outlawed to have any kind of music. Addie tells us that her father is also a musician and he taught her to play the violin. They talk about how there's laws about music now and that instruments were confiscated, and Addie learned how to play in secret because she loved it. They talk about how without their soldiers that Dacre is going to reign. So they decide together they need to tell the truth so that more soldiers will join the war. Roman's letters tells her about Inva's harp, that her mother created it from dragon bone with strings made of hair, and that the frame was held together by the wind itself and only Inva's hand can make it sing. He tells her that he'll be gone for a while. Iris asks where he's going. She doesn't get a reply. So then we get to chapter 25. Iris and Addie are planting seeds in the garden and the daytime sirens go off. They know they have 2 minutes before the Ethereals arrive. So they go inside, they get everything ready, and then Iris looks out the window and sees someone walking toward them. She can't tell who it is, but then she goes and gets Addie's binoculars and she sees and she realizes that it's Roman. She is like in shock of what is he doing here, but she doesn't have time to process it because she knows that the Ethereals are coming and he doesn't know what to do about the sirens and that he's going to get them all killed. Iris runs out to save him and he sees her running and realizes her fear, and he starts sprinting towards her, and they're still sprinting to each other despite the sirens having stopped, and she tells him to stop, but he keeps running for her. They reach each other and she throws him to the ground. She's on top of him and she whispers not to move and he freezes. He recognizes her fear and like he doesn't know what's going on, but he just trusts her. She closes her eyes and she feels the temperature drop. She can tell that Roman sees something because he tenses, and she knows she's shaking over him and he braces a hand on her. She focuses on Roman to distract her from the Ethereals, and then it says that she starts to feel a little bit guilty thinking about her pen pal because she's like laying on top of Roman having thoughts about him, but she also has feelings for her pen pal. She's trying to figure out between the two of them what's going on. And then she opens her eyes and sees that Roman is staring at her, and they stare at each other until the Ethereals leave, and when they're safe she's like, what in the world are you doing here? He's like, what are you doing? What did you think when you hear this siren? And he was like, I didn't know what the siren was. I thought it meant hurry into town. So he says she shouldn't have risked herself for him, and he apologizes, and he tells her that he's there to write about the war, same as her. She confronts him. She's like, you got this promotion that you wanted, and now you're here. Why did you leave it and become a war correspondent? He tells her he's broken his engagement and that his father is angry, and she is like, what is going on? So she takes him to Marisol's, and Roman meets Addie. Roman has brought copies of their paper for them to see, and that was really special. So Iris is emotional seeing her own work on the front page, and he says that their city is realizing the war is not too far from them. So then Marisol meets Roman, and they tell her that they used to work together. Iris is thinking about her mother. In chapter 27, Roman's late for breakfast. She goes to see where he is, but he's not there. He comes in from a run. She writes to Carver saying she misses his letters. Roman asks Iris if she wants to run with him. They just go on a run together, and they chat, and they spend time together. Then in chapter 28, Carver writes her. Carver is like the name she knows as her pen pal, even though we know it's Roman, she knows it as Carver. So Carver writes her that he had a dream about her and asks how she is. She tells him that she missed him, that her rival from her previous coworker has shown up where she's at, and she sends him more letters for the wounded. She asks what he does for his job and for fun. They're working in the garden, and Roman is upstairs writing something, and he hollers down and asks for a synonym for sublime, and Iris says divine, and Addie says transcendent. This is crucial for later when she realizes his identity behind the letters. But then the captain comes asking for a war correspondent to come to the front with them, and Iris immediately volunteers because she's like, it's my turn. Addie already went, and Roman says he wants to go with her. He says he doesn't want her to go without him, but there's only one seat in the lorry. He's terrified something might happen to them at the front, but he says he's more terrified that something would happen to her alone. So Iris is upset. She doesn't want him to go. She sees a letter from Carver, but she's interrupted and she isn't able to finish reading it. And Roman says this is not a good time for her to read this letter. I need to interrupt her or whatever. And so he does, and she doesn't get to finish it, and then she packs it away to go with her to the front. Chapter 29, Iris and Roman are riding to the war front. There's only one seat, and Roman tries to stand on the outside and hold on while they ride, but the roads are so bad, she just tells him to come in, and she sits on his lap for the rest of the ride. She talks about that a little bit. Then they arrive. They've been assigned with the captain of the Sycamore platoon. Iris and Roman walk 4 kilometers to the trenches with the company. The company divides in the trenches, but they stay with the Sycamore platoon. So if they're bombarded, he advises them to flee back to the town. In this chapter, she describes the trenches and what it's like to be part of the war. There's like a scene where she waits for Roman to fall asleep so that she can read the rest of Carver's letter that she brought, that she had been interrupted from reading. Finally, Roman falls asleep and she begins to read the letter. He writes about his grandmother. He says he wants to know everything about her, and then Roman interrupts her again reading the letter because he throws a note to her and asks her what she's reading. She tells him to leave her alone. He asks if it's a love letter. He offers to give her advice. She says she doesn't need advice, and then she falls asleep before she finishes the letter again. In chapter 30, she writes rules for the trenches for civilians. She talks about who ladders are for. She describes the sky as a threat. She says you pray against rain or you prepare to live in flooded conditions, and she describes the experience pretty thoroughly. 3 days come and go in the trenches, and then on the 4th day, Iris is exhausted and she walks the trenches at night and she hears a hound. She goes into a bunker, but it's her living room at home. That's when we realize she's probably dreaming. She gets to her living room at home and her mother is there. Her mother says she's going to be famous. She's so proud. Her mother tells her it's a dream and that she just wanted to see her again, and her mother apologizes. Then Roman wakes her up from the dream and she's crying. Roman comforts her and she tells him that she dreamt of her mom, and Roman stays with her. Then in chapter 31, Roman sees a storm coming in and he's thinking about Iris when the blasts start. So he covers her with his body, but mortars are raining down from all around. He's determined to make sure she survives, so the captain orders them to retreat to the town, but before they can retreat, Roman sees a grenade thrown into the trenches right where they are. He pushes her around a bend so she's out of the way of the bomb, but it explodes before he can get out of the way. So then in chapter 32, Iris recovers from the blast to see Roman. She sees that he's alive, that his right leg has shrapnel, and that he's bleeding. Roman keeps trying to tell her something. He's telling her to get something out of his bag, but she's ignoring him. She's afraid he's not going to make it. She's trying to carry him to get him help. He tells her to leave him there so she can survive, but she's determined to get him safe. That's when she realizes that she has feelings for him, that she wants something more with Roman, and she refuses to leave him behind. And then Roman passes out. He's unresponsive, and she tells him if he dies, that she dies there with him. Iris sees a soldier who can help her carry him. The captain says that he needs Iris's help, so they have to separate. Roman is sent to ride the lorry to get to the infirmary, and Iris has to stay there and help get wounded soldiers out before they are attacked by the enemy. So she leaves him to carry soldiers, and when she does, she finds Roman's bag, so she grabs it and then she makes it back to Allori. Then in chapter 33, she gets to the infirmary and her injuries are clean. She sees Marisol and Addie and she just falls apart. She asks if they've seen Roman. They say he's been in surgery. She goes to find him and she wonders why he came and why he protected her. The nurse tells her that he had 12 pieces of shrapnel removed and no arteries were hit. She goes back, she takes a shower, she's trying to process everything that happened, and then she wakes up. She wonders why there isn't another letter from Carver, and so then she remembers she hadn't finished the letter before. So she goes to finish the letter that he wrote before she left for the front. She sees that he wrote he wants her to know who he is. So this is where he uses the words that Roman asked her about that day in the garden. In his writing, he uses sublime, divine, and transcendent so that she will know that it's him. So, and then he ends the letter by saying that he loves her, that he's in love with her. So she realizes it's Roman, but she thinks maybe it's just a coincidence. But she goes to Roman's bag, remembering how insistent he was that she get it. Whenever he was like dying with the shrapnel, he was like, get my bag, get my bag. So she gets the bag, and inside are all of her letters that she had sent to Carver. So she realizes that Roman is Carver in this moment, and that she had been writing to him and falling for him all this time. So she's like equal parts surprised and very angry. So then in chapter 34, she goes to the infirmary to confront Roman about being her mystery pen pal. So Roman's awake and she's very relieved to see him. She holds up the letter and she says, you, and he looks at her and says, me. And she says, all this time. And he says, what's so hard to believe? She asks how long he knew, and he says, since the beginning. She says, why did you never say? And he says he was afraid she would stop writing. She says he lied. He says he never lied. He asks her to stay. He apologizes. She says he's here to prove he's better than her again, and she tries to leave, but he gets up out of the bed to follow her and says that isn't true. He says, ask me what my middle name is. My name is Roman Carver Kit, and then he kisses her, and she returns the kiss, and she doesn't know what's going to happen next. So then they're interrupted by a nurse. She goes back and rereads all of his letters. She realizes he didn't play her, that he wasn't messing with her, but she doesn't know how to accept it. She remembers that he threw himself between her and a grenade. She's longed for Carver and Roman, and she doesn't know how to put the two together. So it says she's afraid, but she wants to be vulnerable. In chapter 35, she has left Roman alone. It's been like 2 days since she's seen him, and she hasn't talked to him since they kissed in the infirmary. And Addie comes to her and says she needs to go visit him, that he looks like his spirit is broken and that she's worried about him. So she goes to talk to Roman. He's just defeated and really upset, and she asks if he wants to go on a walk with her. So they go on a walk. She just starts answering the questions that the last letter had. So she talks about her favorite things, with salty or sweet and things like that. And then he tells her some things about himself. So they talk to each other about themselves for a little bit. She tells him her middle name is Elizabeth. He says that him coming here to outshine her is the furthest thing from the truth, that he quit his job and broke his engagement to come to her, that he doesn't care to write about the war. He just wants to read what she writes, and he realized he was miserable when she left. So he finally acknowledged he was in love with her, and he decided he wanted to be with her, and he wants a life with her. She asks him if this is a proposal, like, are you proposing to me? And he says, if I ask, will you say yes? Both are like just about died at the war front, and so they realize how short life is, and they're both like, let's get married. Then she realizes he's bleeding, so they get interrupted. They like write letters to each other on their typewriter, even though they're in the rooms next to each other. So then in chapter 36, Iris tells Roman she's thinking about how much time she's wasted, that she protected her feelings because of her pride, and she tells him she wants him to read his letters aloud to her to put Roman and Carver together. So he reads to her while she pulls weeds in the garden, and he reads the letter where he confesses his love to her. She kisses him in the garden. He asks her to marry him, and Iris says yes. He says they should get married that afternoon because a bomb could drop at any time, and she's nervous because she's never been with anyone before. They're like, very quick here because the world is ending. Then in chapter 37, they talk about the western wind outside. It's like a foreshadowing of what's to come. And then Iris and Roman just flirt with each other across the table. She talks about how she feels like it's betraying people to feel joy during this war, that she doesn't feel like it's okay for her to be happy, like have this moment of happiness with him while other people are suffering. And he tells her that she's worthy of love and that he's not going anywhere. And then the evacuation sirens begin to sound. Keegan comes asking for Marisol. She tells them it's time to evacuate. Roman kisses her and she follows Keegan. She says Dacre's army is close and that they'll be here by the next day. So everyone's being evacuated by lorries. Keegan is surprised to hear Iris's name, like she knows something about her. The siren is continuing and Keegan's telling people to evacuate and looking for anyone who wants to stay and fight. So then Keegan and Marisol are reunited and Marisol's refusing to leave. She wants to stay with Keegan. They decide Iris and Roman will evacuate and Marisol and Keegan will stay. But then Keegan has a letter for Iris. It says that Forrest was wounded wounded, taken to an infirmary, and his entire company died, but that he was evacuated from the infirmary and incorporated into a new company and is still bravely fighting in Moriah, only 8 kilometers away. After she gets this information, it like changes things for her because she's like, I'm so close to my brother who I came here to see. I don't want to evacuate. So she hurries to find Roman. Roman's like, I'm going with you. I'm here for you only. And so Iris is worried she's making the wrong decision, but she returns to Marisol's house and she sees dirty boot prints on a piece of paper. And she's like, Roman, did you step on that? He's like, no. And she wonders who it was. And then she sees that the back gate was open and they realize that someone has been in the house. Then in chapter 38, they also see 2 of their evacuation packs have been stolen. So they know somebody's been in and that things are stolen and they don't know what's going on or who would do that. She realizes she needs to set her mother's ashes free. So she does. And she says she's going to fill this last day to the brim because she's afraid something bad's going to happen. Keegan teaches her and Addie how to drive a lorry. Keegan gives them instructions on what to do if things go wrong. And she makes them swear to her that they will drive the lorry and flee with Marisol if things go wrong. And so they do. So they make a plan to get Marisol and Roman and meet at the lorry when things go bad to evacuate. They make some soup for the soldiers and she realizes that Roman has had a shower and she thinks that's weird. And then Addie takes her to have a shower and she thinks that's weird. And then she realizes they're putting together a quick wedding for them. So in chapter 39, Roman and Iris get married in the garden. It's a really quick ceremony because the darkness is coming. So it talks about how Roman cries for his sister and what happened with her and knows he needs to get past that so that he can move on with his life. It says they recite age-old vows and Marisol and Keegan let them borrow rings. They go to Roman's room. Roman asks her to read a letter that she wrote. He tells her that he rereads almost all of her letters every night. And then there's a blackout and Marisol knocks on the door and says they can't use candles or electricity. And then it just goes into their wedding night together and then he is just very insistent that they have to stay together tomorrow. And then it ends on that and it's an ominous ending of that chapter. So then we have chapter 40. So in chapter 40 they wake up and she realizes that it's colder than it should be for a day in the spring. She looks outside and there's no soldiers. They hurry downstairs and someone tells them that the Ethrals are coming into town. She makes a note that Roman still has a slight limp. And then the bombs begin falling. Just talks about how scared she is and that she's afraid the B&B is going to fall. They go out and they see that some houses have been leveled by the bombs. Some are still on fire. They look at all the damage. They see Keegan and she's alive. Then Iris and Roman separate while taking care of wounded soldiers. So she's looking for a stretcher, but she can't find one. She just uses a piece of wood. She realizes that the sun is being blocked out. There's an Ethral. So Keegan tells everyone to get down and stay still. Roman and Iris find each other. They are like, they can see each other, but they're not together. But there's a delirious soldier who's moving and talking, and she's afraid that the soldier is going to get everyone bombed. And so Iris sees something small and silver falling from the sky, and she thinks it's a bomb. And then that's where the chapter ends. Another ominous cliffhanger of a chapter. So then in chapter 41, it's like described that everything's happening in slow motion, that she's seeing the bomb drop and she's having all these flashbacks of her life. So she has a flashback to her birthday as a child when her grandmother gave her the typewriter, another with her brother, she has a flashback with her mother, and then she has one about her and Roman in the garden. And she's waiting for the bomb to fall and memories are flashing in her mind at lightning speed of the people she loved. So then the silver thing hits the ground and it's not a bomb, and the Ethrals are dropping them everywhere. And then all of a sudden gas begins to hiss out. She runs away to try to get away from the gas, but tears are running down her face. She's calling for Roman, but her voice is shredded. The gas is messing her up, all kinds of messed up. She tries to stand, but she's dizzy and she falls. Another soldier yells at her to keep moving. She's just crawling to get away from the gas, but the wind is bringing the gas toward her. She hears someone calling her name, and so she saw Addie and Marisol headed toward the lorry, tries to stand on a barricade for Roman to see her, and someone in a gas mask grabs her. She doesn't know who it is because she can't see them. The book specifically says that the mask is covering the entire face, head, hair, everything. She can't tell who is behind it. It's even distorting his voice. She just assumes it's Roman because who else is going to be coming at her? The person gives her a mask too. She puts it on and breathes through it. She calms down a little bit. She thinks it's Roman. She thinks they're okay. The person says they need to go, and the person tells her, do not look back. And she's like, okay. So she just follows him, still thinking it's Roman. But then she realizes that she's running farther from the lorry and she starts to get concerned. And the person taking her says, no, I'm leading you. You're okay. And she tries to study him, but she can't because of the effects of the gas. It's like messing with her eyes and everything. So then she realizes they're not limping like Roman was that day. And so she's like, it's not Roman. And then she turns and looks back and she sees a tall man with a limp following, and she realizes that Roman is chasing her, trying to save her, and she had been confused. He's screaming for her and he's running as well as he can, but his leg is still injured and he's very messed up from the gas. The person in the mask is telling her to stay with him, but she wants to go to Roman. And then we see Roman collapse into the grass and he's limping towards her, trying with all his might to get to her as best he can, but he is not okay. The person in the mask says, stop fighting me, little flower. So then she knows it's Forrest. Her brother is here. He's the one in the mask who is taking her. He says, yes, it's me. She says they need Roman. Forrest says there's no time for him. She tells him that Roman is her husband, fighting as hard as she can, screaming for Roman. She can't see him. She can't find him. Finally, Forrest grabs her and she starts to pass out. And she sees Roman and he's only 5 meters away. He's fighting as hard as he can to get to her and she's trying to get to him, but they're both hurt. Forrest is taking her away and then she passes out and the last thing she sees is Roman falling into the grass. So then in chapter 42, Iris wakes up. She doesn't know where she is. She's just in a forest. She calls for Roman, but then she sees it's Forrest there. He gives her water and she remembers what happened. She asks again for Roman. Forrest says Roman was too much of a liability to bring to, that he couldn't bring them both. She starts walking towards the west, saying she's going back to find Roman, and he says no. He tells her she can't go back, that Dacre will already have stormed there. Forrest has the 2 dash packs that he stole from Marisol's place and Roman's jumpsuit, so she knows he was the one who had broken in and stolen the things, and she feels betrayed and she's very angry. So finally he says he'll take her back to the place in the field, but not to the town because he knows Dacre is there, as long as she agrees to go with him after. So they make it back to the field and Forrest is right. Dacre already has taken the town. Forrest says they have to crawl through the grass and move slowly in case of snipers. So she crawls through the grass despite it cutting her hands. She finds the spot crumpled from their bodies before and there's no trace of Roman except his blood staining the grass. And then she also notes that there's a dark ring drawn around the spot where he was. And Forrest says, he's not here. I know more than you. And that's all it says. And then we're like, what the heck? So then she crawls back to the woods with Forrest like she agreed she would. She has endless questions for him, but she just doesn't ask him yet. She asks where Roman is. He says it isn't safe to talk about it here. He says he saved her because she was all he could manage. She cries. He doesn't comfort her. She says he feels like a stranger. She realizes they're traveling east. Forrest says they're going to walk as far as they can back home until it's safe to catch a train. She asks where his company is, and she realizes he's a deserter. So he says every last one of his company have died. And Iris is thinking about how she can find Addie and Marisol at Riverdown with Marisol's sister. And then Iris pretends to write a letter for Roman in her mind, telling him that she went back for him. She asks where he is. She dreams of where he is and tells of her fear of what happened to him. On the 4th day of walking, the road comes into view, but Forrest makes them stay away from the road. They go deeper into the woods. She's still hoping to find everyone at Riverdown. Then she realizes that Forrest is bleeding through his jumpsuit and she thinks that's really weird. He says, don't worry about me. They're old wounds. And then she realizes that Forrest is wearing her mother's necklace that she had lost in the trenches. And that's when she puts together that Forrest had been in the trenches where she was, and she realizes that he had been fighting for Dacre and not Enva. She asks him why, and he says, you won't understand. They get to a point where Iris sees 3 scars on her brother's chest, and she says they don't look like they would bleed, despite having just seen them bleed through the shirt not that long ago, so it's weird. She says there's one below his heart, one where his liver is, and one where his intestines are, that they were fatal wounds and he should not have survived. And so she's like, how did he survive those? And then Iris and her brother make it back home. She realizes she hasn't told her brother about their mother dying, so she tells him. They get there and their electricity is off. She feels like Roman was a fever dream because of everything happened so quickly, but she has her ring to remind her that it was real. Then Forrest tells her of storming the trenches with Dacre's forces, and he said that a glimmer of gold in the dirt caught his eye. He says he immediately recognized it and knew that she was there. He said, it took everything within me to break away from Dacre's command. If not for the locket, I don't think I could have done it. So he says he deserted and made his mission to find her. So then he found her, realized she was a correspondent, not a soldier. He watched her, made a plan. He apologized that he couldn't also save Roman, but he said that it took everything in him to desert and to defy Dacre's command and find her. So it makes you wonder if there's like some kind of supernatural something forcing him to fight. The way he described that he saw the locket allowed him to break away from that. It makes you wonder about that, but it doesn't say explicitly. So then she realizes it's not his choice to fight for Dacre, and she asks him to clarify, and he says, yeah, it's not his choice. So she's confused. He tells her he had been wounded and he was left to die in the infirmary in Moriah. He held on for days, but that he was too weak to be evacuated. He says Dacre took over where he was and healed him before he died. Because of that, he held him by the dead of his life, saying he had no choice but to fight for him. So she thinks of images of Roman dying in the grass, and she also imagines Dacre forcing him to join his army, and that's what she starts to be worried about. Forrest says he's done horrible things. He says he knows that she wants to go find Roman and her friends, but he asks her to stay with him because he needs her. She tells him him that she won't leave him. And then she talks herself into hope just so that she can sleep. And right before she falls asleep, she sees a piece of paper in the wardrobe. It makes you think that it's the letter that she had left there before she went to be a war correspondent. Because remember, she left to be a war correspondent and saw a letter, but she left it there. She was afraid if she read it that it would keep her from going. And so she didn't read it. And it says that she opened it and it says, Iris, it's me, Kit. And so then you're like, did he tell her before she left that it was him? Or is this letter somehow from wherever he is now? You don't know. And it makes you wonder, especially in the audiobook, the way that the person reads it, it sounds like he is like desperate. So we don't know that. But so then that is the end of the book. But then we get an epilogue from Dacre's point of view. Dacre waited for his Ethereals to retreat before he went to Avalon Bluff. That's the town where they were with Marisol as war correspondents. So he says the mortals had done a fine job creating this weapon for him. So he's talking about the gas canisters that Roman's fiance's family made, that she told him that she helped her father in the laboratories create. Dacre says they had done a fine job creating this. He decided he wouldn't burn this town to the ground. And he describes the gas leaving everything green. He says green like the mountains, like the emerald ring he wears, and green like Enva's eyes. He talks about how he can heal them before they die. So he says the secret to that is that the will had to still be present in the spirit. And he says that the will shined brightest right before death. So he says mortal souls were like ice or fire, and that ones with ice usually served him best, although sometimes fire surprised him, he says. It tells that he followed the gas to a field and that he felt a gasping soul. He says this one was made of ice, a cold, deep spirit like the sea. He says he sees a young man with raven dark hair crawling through the grass. He says that the man has 1 minute and 13 seconds left to live before his lungs filled with blood and he dies. He says he also has wounds in his right leg. So all of these things make you think it is Roman, even though it doesn't explicitly say his name. It says Dacre is in a good mood that day, or else he might have let the ice in this one melt away. One of his men come and tell him a lorry got away. Dacre wonders why this soul didn't just lay down and die. He wonders what he was fighting for. He says his soul is anguished, nearly rent in half. Dacre describes himself as the god of healing, says he's a merciful god, and realized that this was a correspondent and not a soldier, and that he had never had one of those before, and so he wants him. So he tells his soldier to take Roman below, and that's when it describes the soldier making the ink circle around where Roman was, and it's described as a quick way to open a portal to below. That's all it says, and then it says Dacre looks eastward on the path that will lead him to Enva, the end. So serious cliffhanger that she did us dirty. We have been waiting this whole time to figure out what the heck happened to them, and we are about to find out. So that's the end. That is a complete recap of Divine Rivals. You are all caught up. You are ready for Ruthless Vows on December 26th, and then I will be back to decompress from reading that one with you. So thanks for watching. Follow along if you want to talk more books, because we all know books make life better.